Our world was not like it is today before the internet was invented. Are you curious about the role that the Soviet Union played in the development of the internet? Well, in today's video, we are going to be diving into the fascinating history of the Soviet Union's efforts to create their own version of the internet and why they ultimately failed. So take a seat and join us to learn more about it. Hello everyone, you are watching The Seeker's Edge, where we seek knowledge that's going to give you an edge in life. In this video, we're going to explore the failure of the Soviet Union's attempt at creating the internet. Let's begin. The history of the Soviet Union is complex and it is fascinating, full of triumphs and tragedies, revolutions and wars. From its humble beginnings as a loosely affiliated federation of socialist republics, the Soviet Union rose to become one of the world's superpowers, exerting a massive influence on global politics and shaping the course of history for much of the 20th century. The Soviet Union, also known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was a country in Eastern Europe and Northern Asia established in 1922. The Soviet Union was a communist state and one of the two superpowers during the Cold War, along with the United States. The Soviet Union had a complex and very tumultuous history, and its legacy continues to shape the world today. As you have the context of the story after, now we're going to dig into the history of the formation of the USSR's own internet and its failure. During the time phase between 1922 and 1991, the Soviet Union made significant contributions to the development of the internet, and these contributions are often overlooked in the history of the internet. The Soviet Union is one of the first countries to recognize the potential of computer networks for both military and civilian purposes. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union began developing its own version of a computer network called the All-State Automated System for Querying Information, OGAS. OGAS was designed to be a centralized, government-controlled network allowing government agencies and research institutions to access and share information. It was led by Dr. Vladimir Kitov. Dr. Vladimir Kitov is a Soviet scientist and researcher who played a key role in the development of the internet for the Soviet Union. Dr. Kitov was a leading figure in the development of OGAS, also known as the Academic Computer Network, which was a version of the internet developed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Dr. Kitov was born in 1922 in Moscow, and he received his education at Moscow State University. He went on to work as a researcher and a scientist at various institutions in the Soviet Union, including the Institute of Physics and Technology and the Institute of Informatics. He's a pioneer in the field of computer science and was one of the first Soviet scientists to recognize the potential of computer networks for both military and civilian purposes. The National Automated System for Computation and Information Processing was first proposed by Soviet cyberneticist Viktor Glushkov in 1964. The word OGAS only arose in the 1970s. The system was designed by Dr. Kitov later on to counteract the flaws in the Soviet planned economy, but it did not receive strong government backing. Along with strategic long-term projections, both economic and scientific, by building a nationwide automated computer network, OGAS was tasked with gathering and processing the data required for monitoring and coordinating the work of the economy. The system's innovative way of scientific and technical projections was created by Glushkov and his colleague Kitov. OGAS was developed at the time when the Soviet Union was starting to recognize the potential of computer networks for both military and civilian purposes. The development of OGAS was funded by the Soviet government and intended to be used by government agencies and research institutions across the Soviet Union. However, not everyone in the leadership position were believers in the project. With many opposers, OGAS didn't receive the entire backing of the Soviet Union. Finally, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 also played a role in the failure of the internet within the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the funding and support for the internet disappeared, and the internet was unable to continue to grow and develop in the Soviet Union. Despite OGAS's failures to live up to its intended purpose, it was essential in developing computer networks and the internet in the Soviet Union. OGAS helped lay the foundations for the development of the internet in the Soviet Union, and it inspired other countries to explore the potential of computer networks and the internet. After the OGAS computer network failed, the Soviet scientists experimented with a new computer network system, also known as Academset. Academset was developed by a group of Soviet scientists and researchers, also led by Dr. Vladimir Kitov. The development of Academset was funded by the Soviet government, and it was intended to be used by researchers and scientists across the Soviet Union. The story of Academset was a significant step in the Soviet Union's efforts to develop the internet. Before the development of Academset, the Soviet Union had developed a computer network called OGAS, as you know, or the All-State Automated System for Querying Information, as you also know. However, OGAS could have been more successful and lived up to its intended purpose. Academset was designed to be a decentralized network, which means that it wasn't controlled by any central authority. This was a departure from OGAS, a centralized, government-controlled network. The goal of Academset was to create a network that would allow researchers and scientists to share information and collaborate on projects without interference from the government. Academset was introduced first to the public in 1988 to the conference in Moscow, when it was initially available to only a small group of researchers and scientists. However, the Soviet Union's efforts to develop and promote Academset were not only very horribly unsuccessful, it also didn't become very widely used in the Soviet Union at all. Now we'll move on to the main reasons that led to the failure of the Soviet Union's internet. OGAS was unsuccessful, and it didn't live up to its intended purpose. One of the main reasons for this was the Soviet Union's strict control over information and communication. The government censored and restricted access to certain information, and it took a lot of work for researchers and scientists to share their work with one another. Academset was also not very successful, and it did not become very widely used. One of the main reasons for this was that the Soviet Union had a lack of resources and infrastructure. The Soviet Union was a large, sprawling country with a poorly developed transportation and communication infrastructure, which made it difficult for researchers and scientists to access and use Academset, even if they were interested in doing so. In addition, the Soviet Union's strict control over information and communication also hindered the development of the internet. The government continued to censor and restrict access to certain information, and it was difficult for researchers and scientists to, share their work with one another. This made it difficult for the Soviet Union to develop a vibrant and active online community, so Academset didn't become widely used. Despite the Soviet Union's efforts to develop and use the internet, it was ultimately unsuccessful in creating a version of the internet that was widely used and effective. The Soviet Union's strict control over information and communication, combined with a lack of resources and infrastructure, made it difficult for the internet to thrive in Soviet Union. However, the Soviet Union's efforts to develop the internet weren't entirely in vain. The Soviet Union's contributions to the development of the computer networks and the internet were very significant. They helped to lay the foundations for the modern internet. The Soviet Union's efforts to develop and maintain the internet also inspired other countries to explore the potential of computer networks and the internet, which ultimately led to the rapid development and widespread adoption of the internet as we know it today. So in the end, the world was changed for the better by the Soviet Union's efforts to establish the internet. Despite it finally failing to construct a successful and extensively utilized version of the internet, the Soviet Union made substantial contributions to the growth of computer networks and the internet that helped set the groundwork for the contemporary internet that we all know and love. By encouraging other nations to investigate the potential of computer networks and the internet, the Soviet Union's efforts to establish the internet ultimately sped up its creation and led to widespread use. After seeing and discussing so many facts, what are your thoughts on developing the Soviet Union's internet, or that whole piece of history? We're going to be very glad to see your opinions in the comment section down below. And with that, that's a wrap up for today's video. Please subscribe to The Seeker's Edge. And until then, later.